This is Mae Brussell. It is World Watchers tape number 854, April the 25th, 1988. Last week on World Watchers, April the 18th, I talked about the National Alliance and William Pierce, who took over the American Nazi Party, changed its name to the National Alliance, and how their group had bought 100 shares of AT&T and hoped to influence the board of directors at their annual meeting in Denver, Colorado, that would take place April the 20th. One day after I made the tape for you, on April the 19th, there was an obituary in the papers all around the country. The president, former chairman of AT&T, passed away very suddenly. James E. Olson, 62 years old, passed away. He'd been operated 3 weeks before for a colon tumor, one obituary said, and they, of course, added, "All of us in the company are shocked at the suddenness of Jim's death." Another obituary said Mr. Olson's deterioration was rapid. The company said the cancer was diagnosed after he became ill and had the flu March the 18th. With the flu, they did surgery and 7 days later removed a tumor on the colon. A similar 3-week cancer is that of Jack Ruby, who was all puffed up and swollen, and his sister saw him in the cell, and he was sending notes out of the Dallas jail that Lyndon Johnson and the John Birch Society were behind the murder of John Kennedy, and 3 weeks later he was dead. He was taken to a hospital right away and had cancer. The diagnosis was cancer. The meeting in Colorado was described in the Wall Street Journal, not a total success for the Aryan nations, but on the other hand, they made a little headway there. The Wall Street Journal said that Mr. Allen, the new president, he was appointed immediately after Mr. Olson died, within a day, was presiding over the meeting, and he spared any major controversy at the annual meeting, despite a rally against racism by the local 777 and the proposal of the National Alliance to stop hiring blacks was voted down. The Wall Street Journal said the National Alliance proposal did guarantee that blacks would be hired. That the vote was 6% for recommitting AT&T to affirmative action. That's 6%. But there was a proposal that got enough votes to make it be resubmitted next year in the proxy. And Mr. Allen said that AT&T at times tried to block the National Alliance, but they weren't successful. So next year they will have another vote on the matter. The reporting of the meeting was on national television, and also I have a copy of a report in the San Francisco Examiner, April 21st, and this said that the stockholders attending the company's annual meeting voted down by an even larger motion. They voted down against stopping the hiring of blacks. But by an even larger margin, a resolution calling for the advancement of more women and minorities in management was voted down. "We lost one battle, but the war has just started," said Herbert Poinsett of Norcross, Georgia, who came on behalf of the National Alliance, the Nazi group. And he wants to get the vast majority, he said, of white people in this country to wake up to see that they are being displaced by people who shouldn't be taking over their jobs. So he did have a victory of a sort where they can hire minorities and women, but they can't, on the other hand, be advanced. They're calling for a resolution to stop the advancement in the management, and that seems to have gotten a good sound boost from the various people from AT&T. So next year they will be back again doing the same thing until we have a real good depression, and then wait and see. They'll yell, "I told you so," and it will be like Germany, where the Jews were taking the jobs away from the Germans at the time of unemployment. The Monterey Herald had a story April 17th, "Freed prisoner calls on judge." The mastermind of two of Italy's most sensational post-war scandals made a courtesy call last Friday on the judge who ordered his release from jail. Licio Gelli said, "I want to thank the magistrate who, by granting me provisional liberty, has given me back my life." Antonio Pizza, who ordered the provisional liberty, was one of the persons, the judges, who charged Jelly with fraudulent bankruptcy in 1982 with the collapse of Banco Ambrosiano, Italy's largest private bank. And the judge was visited by Licio Gelli to thank him for letting him be free out doing his thing on the streets. The Los Angeles Times had a story this past week, which has been suppressed except in the Miami Herald. This is the story that I had on World Watchers 840, January the 11th, 1988, on the Health Maintenance Organization and the people behind Miguel Recarey Jr., Jeb Bush, the son of Vice President Bush, Lynn Nofziger, John Shears, the who's who of a lot of political heavies on the East Coast. And this was having to do with the Medicare system, the international medical centers under the control of Mr. McCary, who has left the country, taking $1 million or more behind him. And the danger of this particular operation that I called attention to had to do with giving medical care and contracts for thousands of Haitians that were put into the medical center here down in Florida, and they handled Cuban refugees and 10,000 automatically enrolled families. And I thought of the potential of AIDS and the sinister connections, which I'm going into more with the main subject that I want to put on this tape for you. But the LA Times has a story, April 18th. Former White House aide Lynn Nofziger played a key role in a private health firm's multi-million-dollar lobbying campaign to loosen federal regulations protecting Medicare patients. And this article tells how Lynn Nofziger was lobbying in Washington and received $40,000 for the lobbying. And I mentioned before, Lynn Nofziger is a business partner, or was, owning real estate with Helene Von Damme, the mysterious Helene Von Damme from the Reagan administration in California, and then appointment secretary in the White House. And he's been close to her, and Lynn Nofziger has been directly linked in the Watergate period to the American Nazi Party, and hoping to get their votes and working with them. And Von Damme, his partner, has always been a mystery person in relation to how, as appointment secretary, many of these people got jobs in the Reagan administration that are turning out to be so corrupt now. Of course, obviously, she wasn't fit to make these appointments, but they're very fit to cover them up. So the Los Angeles Times has a story mentioning Jeb Bush and Lynn Nofziger. It's not a wire service story. It's only in the LA Times, April the 18th, but I think it's interesting that they at least have it, which is more than most of the newspapers in the country should have, and it should be making the headlines all around the country. What did make the headlines this week were stories about the material being released on the Robert Kennedy assassination. Of course, one of the headlines in the San Francisco Examiner is Los Angeles police destroyed RFK evidence, and another one burned RFK evidence called superfluous. And then there was a disgusting meeting in Los Angeles put on by Paul Schrade, a man who was actually shot in the Ambassador Hotel. And it was a meeting for a reunion of friends of Robert Kennedy. The subject was RFK Remembered. It had nothing to do with his assassination. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. was there. It was held at Loyola Marymount University. And alleged friends of Robert Kennedy, including his daughter Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, Frank Mankiewicz, Cesar Chavez, Tom Hayden, and so forth. And Paul Schrade put this together. He said it's a victory of life over death, but I believe the killing of John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy is a victory of death over death, because this country started turning backwards in 1963 and 68, and it has gone downhill ever since. In fact, Mr. Schrade was angry that March Fong Hu, the Secretary of State of the state of California, released these documents on the Kennedy assassination. He wanted her to hold them back till the conference was over, because he didn't want any conversation about the situation of the murder of Robert Kennedy. It really makes you wonder sometimes where these people's heads are at. And I'm not going into all the details of those files. A lot of it was in the newspapers, and I may update it for you later. But many of you are new listeners and don't remember. It seems like yesterday to me. But I wrote an article on the Robert Kennedy assassination, a short one, for Midnight, that small newspaper that gets out like the Star and the National Examiner and so forth. called Nixon's Pals, the CIA link to Robert Kennedy assassination. And across the top says evidence of investigator reveals startling information. This is the one that I wrote for Midnight, a short article. I do want to get a book out of all the articles I've written, and some of these I haven't shared with you on the air, or I did it a long time ago. Many of your subscribers going back to 1976, but for the new ones, most of you are new. I just want to run through, because this is the bottom line on the Robert Kennedy assassination as far as I'm concerned. We know the evidence was destroyed and witnesses were killed and others are silenced, such as Paul Schrade, etc. But this is the real story. Who is behind the people who are the selected patsies? That is always one of the big, big stories. What I wrote is that the web of illicit CIA activity has routes that are tangled with the relationship of Richard Nixon that spread from the John Kennedy to the Robert Kennedy assassination. Sirhan didn't kill Robert Kennedy alone. The chain of events that brought him to the United States from Palestine and put the gun in his hand implicates many people. I wrote, it started in Palestine, where American agents within the Greek Orthodox Church gave money to the Sirhan family. This is the same conduit that brought Marina Oswald to this country and that serviced her needs in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. They funded the Sirhan family. This funding continues. Once people get to the United States, it doesn't end, and they were brought to America. It involves a well-to-do California husband and wife who sponsored their passage to this country. The wife, the study claims, is the sister of an old college friend of both Richard and Pat Nixon from their days at Whittier College. In the 1950s, the couple also moved in the same social circles in Pasadena as their Senator Richard Nixon, and the Sirhan families to move to Pasadena. I said then it may all be coincidence, but you can't overlook the way the family traveled and asked some questions about it. I said that in 1976. In 1988, I don't believe there are many coincidences. And I referred to, after the Watergate investigation started opening the Senate investigations into the CIA, revealed by those and by President Ford that the CIA infiltrated the churches, and I believed it was time to reopen the Bobby Kennedy assassination just based upon the conduit of the churches and these people, how they ended up in the cities where they did, given the acts that they've been charged with. From early accounts of the Sirhan family, they were a poverty-stricken family that were driven from their home during the Arab-Israeli War in 1948. It is also known that the Sirhans were steady churchgoers. They were Lutherans in Palestine. They belonged to a Lutheran congregation. But in 1956, they strangely changed their allegiance and joined the Greek Orthodox Church. And immediately after, the family fortunes improved, and they were making plans to move to America. Now, put in the time slot of what I was writing then, 12 years ago. In 1956 is when Otto Skorzeny, who worked for the CIA, was setting up the Middle East operations, not only in Egypt and Libya, but working through the whole Middle East. Skorzeny worked for the CIA, worked with the Reinhard Gehlen operation that was involved in the Dallas-Fort Worth and Pasadena part of these assassinations. And all of a sudden, this church switch causes them to get tickets for the family to America. Sirhan was only 12 when they arrived in New York. The father stayed on in Manhattan. The mother and the 3 children went to California, where she worked as a domestic. 2 sons joined them later. According to the New York Times, the father worked as a plumber in New York City. He found himself a good job also in an East Coast defense plant. They had really hardly anything in Palestine. They were dirt poor, but the papa starts working in a defense plant in New York. Either way, I wrote, it seems odd that an alien could suddenly get a job in a defense plant and that he could come over here and get right away into the plumbing union, because this is not only a highly competitive field, but it's almost impossible to break those family-held union ties, building union ties in New York City. Meanwhile, out in Pasadena, Sirhan's mother purchased a home. She was able to buy her own home. A modest house, but considering the supposed poverty of the family, they owned the home in Pasadena. The father worked as a plumber and also in a defense position in New York. Then there was a link between bringing the family here, the Greek Orthodox Church, and the CIA. I asked, was there a link, or as they're quoting me as the investigator said it, Are these people sleepers, I asked, that would be used years later? A sleeper is a person planted in a community for the purpose of espionage. And I said, I know there are sleepers all over the country to be used later, often years later. It's like the police departments and the FBI use men who have prison records. They keep them out of jail so long as they perform, but they have a leash on them if they fall out of line. It is interesting that the Sirhans, originally of Jordanian origin, were never in this country given their citizenship. They still haven't got it. They didn't have it by 1976. They can always be deported if they make a mistake. Further evidence that the Sirhans received a payoff of some kind can be seen in the case of the father. He stayed in the United States 1 year, sent the wife and sons to California. He never rejoined them, but went to Jordan. He never worked again. The Los Angeles Times said he lives in one of the town's most substantial stone houses. He owns a 50-acre farm and 2 other residences. And Sirhan's father, this gentleman, just passed away this past year. In Pasadena, even stranger things were transpiring. The New York Times reported that 2 families were responsible for getting the Sirhans to America. One family, a doctor and his wife, were identified in the press. The other couple have never been publicly named. They're probably the Otto Skorzeny team, but they were never named. By the time of the assassination of Robert Kennedy, the church in Pasadena that supposedly helped finance bringing the Sirhan family over here had been completely torn down. The doctor and his wife were both dead. The 2 people that brought him and the other couple, never identified, have disappeared. In fact, nothing was heard about the missing couple until a writer named Ken Kelly spoke on a San Francisco radio station, KSAN, in April of 1976. He claimed that this mysterious family were prominent in Pasadena society, active in the Republican Party and in the Rose Bowl Committee, as was Richard Nixon. They were closely related to the college friends of Pat and Dick Nixon. They attended Whittier College together. They double dated together, and one of the women was Pat Nixon's sorority sister. Sirhan's mother continued to work and worked for them as a housekeeper up until the time of the assassination. The FBI interviewed the sponsoring family after the assassination, but this never became public record of any kind. And I'm sure that must be among the 2,400 pieces of paper that have been destroyed, burned, that they said wouldn't be any use to you. There are many, many more missing links to the Sirhan story. I wrote, for example, the U.S. Department of Justice was able to pinpoint Sirhan's entrance into this country on an alien on permanent resident status, but the Jordanian government never heard of him. They were supposed to have come from Jordan, and the Jordanian government had no record of them. At the Jordanian embassy in Washington, Dr. Walid Saadi, counselor, said there was no record of Sirhan there, or in the Jordanian consulates where Jordanian nationals are registered. And I asked the question, were the Sirhans unknowing patsies for the CIA, and said it is plausible. Sirhan could be used. He was a natural. Our intelligence agency looks for people who have other motives, so it will never appear that the agency is involved. And remember, what was at stake here in the elections in 1968 was Richard Nixon, who was supposed to win the election from John Kennedy in 1960 and didn't. And then Nixon's presidency opened up all the dope and narcotic traffic that started flowing into this country with the Southeast Asian War and the Mafia from the east and west, both ends, flooding this country with narcotics, among other things, and escalating the Vietnam War. So that the election of Robert Kennedy, replacing his brother now in 1968, was a very pivotal year. And so you wouldn't want this to appear as a political assassination. I said Sirhan would have a motive for the appearance of violence or for violence. He did shoot 4 people in the Ambassador Hotel. As a young boy, he had seen a friend of his blown up in front of him, and he had seen all the trauma of the Israeli-Arab conflict. He could be used. Many former emigres from communism, such as Castro's Cubans, people from the Greek Orthodox Church who escaped from Stalin's Russia, were used for political assassination teams and cover-ups for domestic intelligence operations. Even when the CIA planned to assassinate foreign leaders, they went to the Mafia so it wouldn't look like the CIA was involved. When E. Howard Hunt needed a team to break into Watergate or into psychiatrist Daniel Ellsberg's office, he went to the CIA, and the CIA gave him the name of a Cuban locksmith. Martinez, Gonzalez, and Sturgis, they didn't give them a locksmith in Washington. They would make it appear the Cuban. And it was a Cuban, but it happened to be anti-Castro Cuban. And I said in this article, why did they do that? Because they have the mentality that if they're told the Cubans are giving money to the Democrats or to Daniel Ellsberg, they can say it is a communist. And the others will say, I hate communism. I was kicked out of the country by communists. Therefore, I'll break into those offices. This same type of situation existed with Sirhan. He went through the trauma with his best friend blown up, and these things stay with you all of your life. So if you say a Jew did the blowing up and Bobby Kennedy is giving money to Israel, you got a natural motive for a cover-up. And I went on to say that it's possible to hypnotize Sirhan, to forget what he did, who funded him, and who's behind him. You can erase his memory. And then I mentioned the Senator Frank Church's committee, the evidence on the use of drugs and amnesia on unsuspecting people. What is amnesia, I asked, but forgetting process. And Sirhan doesn't remember very much. To this day, he's still asked to be taken to the Ambassador Hotel to see if his memory can be refreshed, but they won't let him. And I concluded by saying he sits in Soledad prison, probably for life, the alleged lone-crazed assassin. And I always faulted Bill Turner and other people working on the Robert Kennedy assassination because they never wanted to go into the background of the Sirhan family, and it was directly linked to Pasadena, to Richard Nixon, to the intelligence community and the change of residents, their ability to fly from Palestine that in Jordan right into Pasadena, the hard home of Richard Nixon and his cronies and the Lincoln Club and all that goes with it. And the father then buying a home back in the old country and the mother buying a home here and being very comfortable until Sirhan in college, who has an anger towards Israel, and the violence there can be used as a sleeper. And the bottom line, I believe, in that story is how they got here, just as the bottom line in the John Kennedy assassination is, what were Leah and Marina doing in the Soviet Union? How did they meet? Why did the Greek Orthodox Church and John Tower sponsor her getting here, etc.? So that's, I think, the most potent and important part of the Robert Kennedy assassination, and no single researcher except myself ever brings it up, thinks about it, or wants to confront the conspiratorial aspects and the way they go back the roots to those matters. Now, speaking of conspiratorial matters, I'm going to share with you an article. You may get it at the library. It's from Barron's magazine, the National Business Financial Weekly, published April the 4th, 1988. The title is Rogue Justice: Who and What Were Behind the Vendetta Against INSLAW. INSLAW is a contract, a company that got a contract for the Justice Department. Now, a long listener to World Watcher sent me this article, and I read it yesterday and outlined it. It took me 6 hours to outline it into 14 pages. That is a lot of intense concentration. I can't put it on one tape or two. I may put all the other news aside and just make the next tape and the remainder of this on this particular article. Why is this article important? For many, many reasons, and one of them, of course, is that it encompasses all the conspiratorial aspects of what I've been trying to say on World Watches for the past 17 years. You have to read it, and you can't read it fast, and you have to understand the many, many implications, and I'll share them with you and put them on the sheet and outline part of it for you with the sheet that accompanies these tapes. But you have to concentrate on what this article is saying, and I'm going to do it with you. The two of us can do it together better than you can do it alone. It covers biological warfare and what I think it may be the seed money for financing the AIDS project. It involves turning the total justice system into a police state. It has to do with moles in the Justice Department that were beginning to be set as soon as Daniel Sheehan began to get his case together and file a civil lawsuit in Miami and with the Christic Institute. It has to do with the Justice Department manipulating and purposely breaking corporations, because if they did it to one, they've done it to other, breaking a corporation, not allowing bankruptcy, but liquidation, and having the person who will receive it waiting like a basket for a basketball to come into it. It involves the Alameda Mafia that I've detailed on World Watchers for years. It brings up questions that I had at the time of the MEESE confirmation hearing that are now in the news, such as that company Hadron and the ownership of Hadron, and the portent of the IRS becoming a police state branch of the Justice Department. There's so many implications here. I often take a book and read the last chapter first, or see a movie and want to know the end first. That's a trait of a Gemini. But I want to just start this broadcast, this part of it, on INSLAW with the conclusions of what happened, because this involves what happens to inventors or scientists when somebody else is waiting to take over their inventions and steals them from them, either takes the corporation completely, and in some cases I've known of medicated, drug them, control them, kill them, brain experiment on them. This has to do with greed and power, but it doesn't come out of other offices of the government, like immigration or even the military or health, welfare, and it doesn't come out of the other departments. It comes out of the Justice Department. So it makes justice a contradiction, such as military music or whatever. There's no justice there. And the stranglehold that Reagan MEESE have on the Justice Department is forever. It is part, I believe, of that 1,000-year Reich, of the effect of Otto von Borschwing in California with Von Damme and Reagan. It is horrendous. Now, I'll just give you a couple of references or quotes at the conclusion of the article, then we'll go into the beginning and end up with the conclusion later. A man, an attorney named Charlie Doctor, D-O-C-T-O-R, was the attorney for INSLAW and for a man, Bill Hamilton, who owned this computer company that got a contract with the Justice Department. And Charlie Doctor, the attorney, was talking about the IRS, and the IRS is brought into this case, and the Justice Department wanted to squeeze this man out for vindictive reasons, for pure profit, for police state and everything. Charlie Doctor said regarding the IRS position, he said the whole thing smacks of a police state, and this scares the hell out of me. This is Barron's National Business Financial Weekly. This isn't some hokey-pokey little leftist, neurotic person worrying about that police state. He said the whole thing smacks of a police state, and it scares the hell out of me. Scary is the word that is used by the victims of this entire INSLAW affair. The article was written by Maggie Mahar, M-A-H-A-R. In fact, when I complete this tape, I'm going to write to Barron's and congratulate her for this brilliant article. People like this don't write very often. It reminds me of the quality of Jeff Gerth when he wrote about Resorts International and Richard Nixon and William Rogers and that whole combine that he did in Sundance magazine at the time of the Watergate hearings. Scary, as I say, is the word used by the victims. They are angry, they are hurt, they can't believe what happened. The Justice Department engaged in a vendetta to end the career of a federal judge. They got him fired. They bankrupt a company. The justice engineered all this. They forced a partner out of his own law firm. They caused another federal judge to recant his story under oath, and they reached down and wrecked the career of a 21-year government service employee. They said they would set him loose with a recommendation if he shut his mouth. And this story also has to do with the resignation of 6 people March the 30th regarding Edwin Meese's affair, and it turns out that these people had to get out, evidently because this story was closing in on them. They didn't resign because Meese was going to be prosecuted. They left for another reason. Now, along the lines of this story and part of it, not separate, is a article in the Wall Street Journal called The Near Totalitarian IRS, because this material on INSLAW goes into the IRS. And this is written by David Power, April 15th. that the IRS employees are using networking computers and have virtual freedom through the most fearful agency in the United States. They are operating a near totalitarian system. They have the power to unilaterally order the seizure of a person's property or garnishing of his income. The person has hardly any rights other than to pay for the deficiency. And this article, I'll just begin with it on the other side of this tape, and then get into the story in Barron's magazine, Rogue Justice, Who and What Were Behind the Vendetta Against it's INSLAW, INSLAW. So we'll start with the IRS and then get right to that story. This is Mae Brussell, and this is the second half of tape number 854, April 25th, 1988. Just quickly getting back to the Wall Street Journal story, near totalitarian IRS, refer to the case of Shirley Lojeski of Pennsylvania. She owed the government no back taxes. She had committed no crime. The IRS seized her bank account without warning as part of an enforcement action it was taking against her boyfriend. They suspected the boyfriend might be funneling money through her account, which he wasn't. Only a small fraction of the $247,000 that paid the IRS had been owed. She didn't get any of her money back till 4 months after the case was settled. By that time, she nearly went bankrupt. The government, the IRS, ordered her bank account seized. The man who did it got a promotion, and the promotion is key to this story I'm also referring to that we'll share from Barron's. And Mrs. Lachowski got a bill for $30,000 in legal fees. And the article says another taxpayer was harassed over a tax he already paid. And even after the service conceded he had paid it, it filed a lien against his house. And this article says that the Congress is now actually having a bill to stop the IRS and have protection for the citizens. The IRS has increased its power, of course, under Reagan. It has received additional manpower, and it is unwatched, unchecked by Congress, and horror stories continue. The taxpayer's rights, his or hers, to tax proceedings are totally ignored, and now Congress wants a bill that would protect people, that would give them a notice that the IRS is coming, that the legislation would be extended from 10 to 30 days in the notice period, and that they have to give taxpayers some notice before they seize the property, and that you would be able to sue the IRS for damages to legally protect yourself if you haven't done anything wrong. So this bill is before the Congress right now. Hopefully it'll pass, and of course the IRS opposes it. And now to this amazing story. One of the judges, as I say, Judge George Basin, was fired. Tony Pessuto, the whistleblower, was fired and taken off his job. Lee Ratner, an attorney in Washington, D.C., was fired from his law firm. 6 people from the Justice Department resigned. One was promoted out of all this, who was an active participant in this horrible story. Lowell JENSEN became a judge in California, and he's, of course, one of the people I've talked about for years as part of the Reagan Mafia. Dangerous person. And IBM was a winner. They acquired the company INSLAW. And, of course, I referred, and we'll go back to it in a few moments, last week's broadcast I was talking about Padachevsky's Play Network, where there are no nations, there's just companies, including AT&T and IBM. Well, IBM acquired the company that the Justice Department had contracted with and forced to go bankrupt, and it was gobbled up by IBM. The corporations are eating, swallowing, gulping the little small companies. They force them out of business and are ready to grab them. It is a real live game called Catch the Company. Now, INSLAW is being taken over by IBM, was a software company, a small software company, and their trouble began in 1982. When they got a $10 million contract with the Justice Department. Ronald Reagan was sworn in 1981, and by 1982 he had his muscles and his hands into the Justice Department. The founder of the company, his name is Bill Hamilton, and the Justice Department brought the Prosecutors Management in. They bought what is called the Prosecutors Management Information System. That was his system into the computer. it spells down, it's broken down to PROMIS, Prosecutor Management Information System, PROMIS. If I refer to PROMIS, that's the computer system that the Justice Department bought, and Mr. Hamilton had spent his life, most of his life, and his life savings building this system, which he was able to sell to the Justice Department in 1982. Then things took a mysterious turn. Payments were withheld from the Justice Department. They bought the system, and he hired people then to start producing, and payments started stopping coming in for what he was already working on. There were contract disputes that people took up that he didn't understand that began to be multiplied like agent provocateurs in the system. There were threats that were made and accelerated, and he didn't know what was happening to him or why, after working all his life, making a thing which worked, selling it to the great United States Justice Department, and things were going wrong. And all of a sudden the cash flow stopped coming in, and it was shriveling. And by 1985, he had 3 years of working, trying to put this together for the Justice Department. By 1985, his place was in shambles financially. I might tell you another part of the punchline, we'll get to it, that there recently was a $6.1 million settlement by the federal government that you taxpayers paid for his harassment that you didn't do, that MEESE did, and Ronald Reagan's team did, Lowell, JENSEN, and MEESE in that group, and others that I'll mention. But there's a $6.1 million that he already got as a settlement, and the judge, though, was fired from the case for siding with him. And there may be a $25 million payment settlement to him, but that's why the one judge was fired and the new judge brought on. And I can see now why Judge Bork wanted to be in the Supreme Court so desperately with his mindset on these things. But they went into financial shambles, and Bill Hamilton ended up in a bankruptcy court, which he had never done or dreamt he was going to have to do. And the federal judge who handed down this astonishing ruling in 1987, as I say, was favoring the Mr. Bill Hamilton and his problems, then was removed. The judge was Judge George Basin, who sided with Mr. Hamilton in this case, and he found, his conclusions were, and he stated in the court and so forth, was that the Justice Department, now this is the Justice Department, had purposely propelled INSLAW, had on purpose caused its bankruptcy in an effort, he said, to steal its PROMIS software through trickery, fraud, and deceit. That's what the judge said, that the Justice Department did. On February the 2nd, 1988, Judge Basin ordered the Department of Justice to pay INSLAW in licensing fees and $1 million in legal fees. The punitive damage may run as high as $25 million. The trial testimony revealed an unexplained series of coincidences around the case. The justice appointed a man named C. Madison Brewer, whose nickname is Brick, we'll refer to him as Brick Brewer, was the man to be in charge to oversee the INSLAW contract. The contract was bought, as I say, in 1982, and Mr. Brewer was in charge of the contract in the Justice Department. But Brewer had worked for Mr. Hamilton and had been fired by him. And it turned out that the Justice Department and the people working there, coming from the Alameda Mafia that I had cited way back when MEESE was getting his confirmation hearings in March of '84, 4 years ago, they bought it because they needed the material. Then they squeezed the man out so they could steal what he had. And the person in charge of squeezing him out was a man who had been fired by Hamilton. He fired him in May of 1976. That was 5 years before the contract. And according to the judge, this Brewer was filled with hatred, described by Judge Brewer as consumed with hatred towards his former employer. And they couldn't figure out why the Justice Department picked the man to administer the contract who was filled with hatred towards Hamilton. And, of course, the answer, you'll find, is in the dollars. And the question asked in the article, why did the Justice Department condone a vendetta against a small private company? Judge Brewer wanted to know. November 86, Judge Basin, rather, in November of 86, Judge Basin rejected the Justice Department motion to liquidate. They didn't want him just in bankruptcy. The Justice Department wanted it liquidated completely and then, as I say, the vultures would take the body. 1 month later, Judge Basin learned that he would not be reappointed to the bench. This is December of '86. In the past 4 years, only 4 of 136 federal bankruptcy judges who were seeking reappointment have been turned down. Judge Basin was replaced by S. Martin Teal, T-E-E-L, a Justice Department attorney who wanted INSLAW liquidated and had been turned down at the time. So the new judge is one who wants the company liquidated. The one who was removed didn't want it liquidated. Now the Justice Department, according to former Judge Basin, can make the important decision on the punitive damages, which will probably be 0. For a while, Judge Teal has recused himself from the case. The Justice Department is appealing, and the INSLAW versus USA hangs in limbo. Now, a gentleman named Tony Pasuto, P-A-S-C-I-U-T-O, became the Justice Department whistleblower. He felt very badly about what was happening, and now he was waiting for a verdict on his 21-year career. Worked with the government 21 years, and finally was given walking papers if he never told anybody what happened, and they'd give him a recommendation because he was ready to sue the government. 2 weeks ago, he revealed for Barron's magazine how the payments for INSLAW were treated and sabotaged. He said the Justice Department colleague responsible for paying the contractor bills out of the Justice Department put them in 3 piles. One pile was paid right away. Next pile was paid when he got around to it. The third pile was a drawer with invoices, and it said, "These may never get paid. If you're on the bad list, you go in the drawer." INSLAW is on the bad list. Now, think about these implications, and I'm going slow on this because is this the mafia? A redundant question. Of course it is. The Justice Department hires a person who has the best computer for what they're doing and then takes the invoices and lets him hire people and start producing what they ordered and tells the others we're not going to pay him anything for it. So the invoices went into drawer 3, and the Justice Department that should be investigating people who have a contract for selling or producing and don't come through with it, and force another person out of business by holding up that money, the Justice Department is supposed to be prosecuting. But this Justice Department under Reagan and MEESE had a drawer for people they contracted for jobs and didn't pay until they squeezed them and forced them to bleed. Cornelius Blackshear, a federal judge and former U.S. trustee who's based in New York City, worked with Tony Prosciutto, the whistleblower, and Prosciutto told him that the Justice Department, his Justice Department superior in Washington, was pressuring him to send someone to Washington, D.C. and help liquidate the company that the Justice Department had hired to do their computer work. And Washington wanted to make sure that this job was done. And when the INSLAW lawyers deposed Blackshear, he confirmed the story. But when Judge Blackshear went back on, this is the judge who worked with Tony Prosciutto, when the judge went on, he recanted his story and was forced to change his story, forced a federal judge to change his story under oath. 1 hour after Tony Prosciutto was subpoenaed to testify, the testimony would come up, and a few weeks later he received a subpoena on this matter. His superiors, who knew he would like to be moving to Albany, New York, offered him a long-awaited transfer in Albany, and this was the bait that they were giving him. And he said he felt scared that he was out there all alone. He bought a home in Albany, and he didn't know what else to do, so he changed his story on the stand. Later he came back and was punished for supporting Mr. Hamilton and what happened to him. But he changed his story on the stand, and the Justice Department forces a judge or a witness, baits them with a home, and when they have the payments and so forth, they will lie on the stand. So the Justice Department is forcing their witnesses to lie. He said he was close to tears when he was forced to recant on the stand, just like the judge. And then Judge Basin recalled that Mr. Prosciutto seemed to be basically honest. He was caught up amongst a gang of very tough people, and he didn't know what to do. Now, what are your choices in the Justice Department? The judge and the attorneys told him to lie. that he was among a gang of tough people. The Justice Department shouldn't be filled with the people threatening to kill you or break your job or whatever, but that's exactly what they are, a gang of thugs. After the testimony, Pasciuto met Judge Blackshear at a party, and he said, "I'm sorry." He apologized. Mr. Pasciuto, the man who changed his testimony, he said, "I'm sorry, but the people from Washington and the U.S. Attorney's Office confused me. I thought by changing my story, I would hurt less people." So there were threats, of course, and the criteria is I can screw over Bill Hamilton and the people he hired and force them to lose their jobs and go bankrupt at that computer company, because otherwise people in the Justice Department will be hurt, and I didn't want to hurt the people in the Justice Department by getting them in trouble. And then his punishment came anyway. After he testified in court, the Justice Department told him, "Sorry, the procedure has changed. You can't be transferred to Albany." So he had a home in Albany that he was getting ready to move to, and began to have to commute from Washington to Albany to get rid of them because of the financial burden, and had to work that out. That was one of his punishments. In April of 1988, Deputy Attorney General Arnold Burns and B. Boykin Rose, Boykin, left the Justice Department. Actually, it was March 30th, April the 1st, that 6 people left the Justice Department, and it appeared that they were leaving because of the Edwin MEESE affair. But this article says it wasn't because of that at all. It was T. Boykin Rose, the aide to the Deputy Attorney General, Arnold Burns, who wrote a letter to Deputy Attorney General when he was in the office together. His aide wrote to his boss and recommended that they fire whistleblower Tony Pasciuto and get rid of them. Now, when MEESE rewarded Lowell Jensen with a lifetime judgeship in California, the Deputy Attorney General became Arnold Burns. And Arnold Burns, the man who left the Justice Department, it turns out this last March, was a hero protesting the sleaziness of Edwin MEESE. He was caught up in the sleaze of Edwin MEESE and evidently forced to leave. This article in Barron's came out April the 4th, and they left the Justice Department March 30th, so they probably got wind, because this very detailed article wasn't written in one day, they got wind that all 6 of them that left were heavily involved in this whole scandal, and that's why they left the Justice Department. And this article goes on to say that T. Boykin Rose, one of the people who resigned, and his boss, Arnold Burns, both wanted Pasciuto fired for helping Mr. Hamilton find out what came down on him and how it happened. But his problems continued, the article said, hanging on to a new home he bought, and he began to say, "I'm like under house arrest." He didn't know what to do. He was waiting to end his 21-year career in the government service. His boss, Thomas Stanton, he said, "Can't fire me, but Deputy Attorney General Arnold Burns will fire me." And how does it feel when you know that the Deputy Attorney General wants to destroy a GS, Government Service 15? It's a scare. It scares me to death. And the article says, last week, referring to March the 30th, the dissidents left the Justice Department, led by Deputy Attorney General Arnold Burns. There are 2 disquieting questions about this that are in the article. Why did the U.S. Department want to liquidate Hamilton Software Company after signing a contract with him that they thought they needed? And how did the cover-up of this scheme continue to destroy INSLAW? And as I say, these top 6 officials who left, one was Deputy Attorney General Arnold Burns, the other was William Weld, head of Criminal Division, who's also involved in the Iran-Contra scandals with Faith Whittlesey. I haven't even done the Weld connections to that. No, that's Trott, Stephen Trott, who became a judge. Reagan has promoted Stanley Sporkin and Lowell Jensen, and he's made judges out of people, Mr. Silberman, who was involved in the Iran hostage rescue failure, the arms to Iran, and so forth. And William Buckley, the intelligence community, Sporkin and Buckley of the CIA. He's making judges of these people to have them in key positions when his administration is over. Mark Robinson left and Jane Serene, those were William Weld's aides. And Weld is also tied into the scandal of LaRouche and North, the FBI spying on Lyndon LaRouche with Oliver North and Secord and Peregrine Corporation. So They got out of the Justice Department March 30th, but they didn't go out clean. They ran, and Burns aides Randy Levine and Boykin Rose left the Justice Department. When they left, the government had already agreed for a settlement to Mr. Hamilton and possibly 25,000 more when these people resign. Now, according to Barron, their exodus represents the climax, and this is getting into the nitty-gritty, the climax of a much larger subterranean game of musical chairs that has been going on in the Justice Department for the past 18 months. Now, this is a complicated article. I've got 16 pages, and I'm on page 2 of my outline. So bear with me, because the subterranean gets deeper, and it could be the whole computerized Fourth Reich under the computer program called the Eagle. And there's so many implications here. But Barron's author takes you right into those deep levels, and she says, according to Barron's, their exodus represents, those six, the climax to a larger subterranean game of musical chairs going on in the Justice Department for the past 18 months. And so I looked at my calendar to see what was happening 18 months ago. They referred to them as moles. What happened was October 86, just 18 months ago, Eugene Hasenfuss landed in Nicaragua. And prior to that, Oliver North was suspected of arming the Contras against the Boland Amendment. If you saw in the newspaper today, the FBI said Ollie North lied, and he said his dog was poisoned and his tires were slashed, and he was naming persons that he wanted the Justice Department to look into and harass. And as they looked into it, they discovered that North was involved with arms to the Contras, and that he was lying about the incidences the dog died of cancer and the tires weren't slashed. But he wanted to use the federal agencies to go against his enemies. But the Justice Department was aware at that time, so they were dealing with something worse than the opening into the Watergate Hotel by the Republicans at time of Watergate. And MEESE and the White House didn't want another Watergate or a Senator Frank Church committee in the opening up of all their activities. So what they did was they seasoned and the little things that they were cooking in the Justice Department by placing moles heavily into every agency where investigations could be sabotaged into the illegal activities of the administration of Richard Nixon, going from 1980 stealing the election papers or for arming the Contras, etc., etc. In 1986, at this time, in October, William Casey was being blackmailed by Mr. Furmark and Khashoggi. They wanted their $10 million loan back and found out it was diverted from the profit of the Iran arms down to the bank account of Willard Zucker, their pal. And in November 86, MEESE had come forward because the Lebanon newspaper talked about the Iran weapons. And the Christic Institute filed a suit in May of 86. And it's just at this time period that when the Christic Institute filed their suit about Lapenka bombings to identify the secret team, that 50, 60, maybe 100 or 200 moles now are carefully placed into the Justice Department, and this article goes into the moles. And also, the paper this morning refers to the reason Ollie North lied was he wanted to get to the Christic Institute and harass Danny Sheehan and turn the FBI against them instead of investigating North and his buddies. So what they refer to as a subterranean game of musical chairs for the past 18 months is tied into those very events of Danny Sheehan hitting upon that secret team and the Iran-Contra affair beginning to break open. Now, the article says the moles were carefully placed in the Justice Department. One insider in the Justice Department said, I know of at least 50 or 60 career employees who've been reassigned or forced out. Some have been forced out, others given other jobs. The department is using background computer checks in order to manufacture reasons for forcing employees to leave. Now think of that implication in this article. The government has employees that have been the federal government, FBI, is using computers. And think of Western Goals, that company that was taking information from the Reagan and MEESE administration and probably from 49 other governors and police departments in major cities and major states around the country. Western Goals run by John Reese and Larry McDonald. When Larry McDonald was killed in September of 83, it went to Carl Spitz Channel. On the board are people like Admiral Moore, John Singlaub, John Patton III, George Patton III, and so forth. But the computers are being used by the Justice Department to check or manufacture a reason to force employees in the Justice Department manufacture a reason to fire people so they can be replaced with moles by using the computers going back to the Vietnam War, to the pro-abortion, etc., etc. And the Barron's article says they're trying to find out or force openings for political appointees that they want. They are buried in what we call moles into the Justice Department. They bury the moles so the next administration can't find them. Go to your library and copy Barron's, April the 4th, 1988. On their second page of this, they get into the moles. Now let me get off the article for 1 second to get into facts. Fact 1, I have fact 13 of them. In 1943 to 45, 100,000 Liebers born or more were raised by the Reich to continue a 1,000-year Reich. Where are they now? Fact 2, they're 40 or 45 years old now. They were given for adoption to other families to be raised by the Gestapo, etc., etc. Are these the kind of young people that go into the AT&T now and have important voices on voting against minority jobs? Where are these people? What countries? Fact 3, that we know that people such as Richard Pipes from Hungary have changed their names. He's on the National Security Council. His name isn't Pipes. He's anti-Soviet Union or peace or anything else except warfare state. And an example is the way people have changed their names to Americanize them. We know that Sven Kramer didn't change his name. He was brought up in Nazi Germany as an infant and brought to this country, and nobody connects them to Fritz Kramer in the National Security Council, who is Fritz, and what are the decisions behind the mentality to manufacture reasons to get people out of office so you make political appointees in the Justice Department that can't be found. I won't run down the 13 facts. I've had them on the program before, but they have to do from World War II up to the present, where these people have worked inside our government. Now, the plan, according to the Justice Department insider, the plan is to place the moles, which are political appointees, then move them into GS, which is government service jobs, where it looks like they work their way up, and they're not long government employees, but they look like that. And they're normally held by career government employees, and the career ones are being moved out. And this article says it will take the next administration at least 2 years to figure out who are the real career employees or the career employees that were pushed out based upon these FBI computers run by William Webster, who is now the CIA director, and who are the political appointees that have been dropped into their slots of the career employees. In the meantime, according to Barron's, the moles are in place, and they will have the historical knowledge of how the organization works, and everyone else will be gone. Now, our time is almost over for this hour, so I want to leave you. I'm building up to who bankrupted this company and how it unraveled. And, of course, the man who bankrupted was none other than this Dr. Bryan, who I talked about 4 years ago at the time of the MEESE hearings, and I've updated it. Dr. Earl Bryan, who worked with Edwin Meese and Ronald Reagan in California. He owns a company called Hadron Incorporated that I had on the air. This was program 642, March 26, 1984. The president of Hadron is Dominic Leahy. And Dominic Leahy telephoned Mr. Bill Hamilton after he got his contract. And this is very sinister. He gets the contract in 1982 in the Justice. And then in 1983, the president of Hadron, owned by Meese and Reagan's crony, and involved with Mrs. Meese's money and funding when they came to Washington and things even more sinister, picks up the phone and asks Mr. Hamilton, will you sell INSLAW? And Hamilton said no. And he's trying to think back on what happened to him, how, besides having the man who he had fired in charge of the contract then, how this happened. And he remembers this telephone call, and the man says, well, I know people high up in government. If you don't sell me your company, I know people high up. So it was Edwin Meese and Lowell Jensen and Ronald Reagan's team from Alameda that began the decline to get him into liquidation, not just bankruptcy, break his back, because when he had a good thing, they couldn't take it over by offering a price. Now, the story in Barron's, just to continue, and next week I'll get into Earl Bryan and the organizations that he has in biotechnology Infotechnology, Zonix, corporations that I had before on the air, and Acumedics. And I believe Acumedics could have been the seed money in 1970 when Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger were moving the German biological warfare out of Fort Detrick and moving another group in, and according to the book, The Higher Form of Killing, and the New York Times articles, worked with Litton Industry, the organization that put the police military junta Nazis into Greece, and this could have possibly been the seed money for the disease AIDS. It's not a very short distance from what Dr. O'Brien was in, and Otto von Borschwing with his links to Warner Lambert and Elmer Bops, and I've had many broadcasts and references to the medical cancer connections to the Reagan administration. There isn't enough time on this broadcast, and I'm going to be doing maybe all next week on this particular company because it's very, very important. Instead of just updating some of the current news, maybe get the rest of it on tape number 855. But I think you have a pretty good background now of how the Justice Department had made its mind up. When they contracted, they got the best computer program they wanted, and then they were going to own it. If they didn't own it, they would liquidate it and buy it in that state, break the backs and careers of an attorney, a judge, force another judge to lie, use computers and moles to take over the Justice Department. It's all here, and as they summarize in this article, it's not a play or a movie or fiction. It's all here, and as the judge says, it's scary. And it is scary because it seems a good overview of the things I've tried to share with you through the years. So I will do most of this next week, even if you get the article at the library, and I hope you do. I'll share it with you and go over the implications of the details because they are really very horrendous.